This is Anam Bastar, and this is part of a series of lectures highlighting the main ideas in Pelagia Goulimari's book, Literary Criticism and Theory from Plato to Postcolonialism. This session is on Chapter 4, The Enlightenment and Romanticism, Reason and Imagination. The Enlightenment and Romanticism are not wholly opposing schools. They are movements locked in tension around the concepts of reason and imagination. The Enlightenment idealized critical thinking, empirical knowledge, and individual autonomy, connecting ancient rational inquiry with modern science. Romanticism, responding to perceived Enlightenment shortcomings, elevated feeling, creativity, and the subjective self. Thinkers like Hume and Kant questioned reason's limits, while others like Coleridge and Shelley sought to heal fractured modernity through imaginative integration. Enlightenment ideals promised universal emancipation, but often excluded women, the poor, and the colonized from this vision. The Holocaust and World Wars exposed the horrors perpetuated in the name of reason, provoking a post-war critique of Enlightenment rationalism. Yet thinkers like Derrida and Foucault reimagined Enlightenment critique not as something to embrace or reject wholesale, but as a legacy to analyze. By tracing these approaches to aesthetic and ethics, the chapter invites a more historically nuanced understanding of how literature both affirms and resists these intellectual traditions. David Hume's Enlightenment project centers on empirical observation, sceptical inquiry, and deep thought about objective knowledge. He applies his skepticism to aesthetics of the standards of taste, rejecting fixed criteria for literary greatness while still seeking patterns of agreement. Hume notes that while judgments of taste vary by culture and temperament, certain works like Homer's retain broad, lasting admiration. This tension leads him to argue for both popular consensus and cultivated refinement as basis for value, revealing the dual pressures in Enlightenment criticism. The popular argument leans on historical admiration by the masses, while the expert argument posits that taste improves through practice and comparison. Yet Hume's reliance on shared admiration raises troubling questions. How does elite taste align with public opinion, and why should refinement yield convergence? Hume's aesthetics oscillate between relativism and universalism, destabilizing both while still seeking a canon. In the end, Hume's elegant skepticism clears ground for new critical standards, but cannot fully escape the prejudices and contradictions it critiques. Edmund Burke attempts to root aesthetic experience in universal principles derived from the passions, linking poetry to social pleasure and the sublime to survival. Unlike Hume, he trusts that self-examination and inner reflection reveal a shared human nature capable of stable aesthetic judgment. His distinction between the beautiful and the sublime categorizes objects and experiences by the responses they evoke, pleasure and relaxation versus awe and fear. Burke's vision is empirical yet theological, claiming to uncover the providential design behind aesthetic emotion. However, his insistence on clear boundaries falters when confronting the sublime's obscurity and intensity, which resist neat classification. Burke's claim to universality is weakened by sexist and racist generalizations, especially in his depiction of female beauty as weakness. Though he aims for rational law of taste, Burke's work ends up revealing the Enlightenment's ideological blind spots and the limits of its empirical claims. Mary Wollstonecraft wields Enlightenment's reason against its own exclusions, advocating women's intellectual and moral development through universal education. Her vindication of the rights of women asserts that without reason, women cannot be virtuous and obedience is not morality. She critiques canonical texts like Paradise Lost, exposing how literature perpetuates ideals of submissive femininity and denies women rational agency. Quoting Milton's Eve, she shows how poetic language disguises patriarchal ideology as divine order, sanctifying inequality. Yet Wollstonecraft also detects in Milton a yearning for companionship that patriarchy thwarts, a conflict embedded within the canon itself. She demands that men extend to women the same standards of rational excellence they claim to themselves, exposing the hypocrisy of Enlightenment universalism. Wollstonecraft's feminism is grounded in classical moral philosophy, but radicalized by political urgency. For her, the true enlightenment lies in dismantling prejudice and cultivating reason in every human being, regardless of gender. Her writing fuses critique and hope, disclosing how literature is both a tool of oppression and a vehicle for liberation. Kant's critique of judgment reshapes Enlightenment aesthetics by declaring that judgments of beauty are not rule-bound, but based on disinterested pleasure. When we call something beautiful, we do not desire it or seek to use it. We simply take pleasure in its form, independent of personal or moral judgment. This detachment defines aesthetic judgment as free from both subjective inclination and objective necessity, marking it as singular but universally oriented act. Kant distinguishes aesthetic judgment from the agreeable and the good. The former is personal, the latter moral, but the beautiful mediates between sensation and reason. Taste, he argues, enables a common sense rooted in form, allowing the individual to claim universality without relying on rigid concepts. In doing so, Kant links the aesthetic to Enlightenment's moral goals, arguing that beauty builds a bridge between nature and freedom, the senses and reason. Artistic genius, for Kant, invents rules by breaking them. It is the imaginative freedom that inspires new forms without precedent. This paradox, creation that defies rules yet becomes exemplary, places art at the heart of a community yet to come, built not on doctrine but shared feelings. Kant's aesthetics, though abstract, are politically charged, imagining a realm of communication and empathy beyond individual interest or historical strife. His legacy is not a cold rationalism, but a bold hope that beauty might reconcile a fragmented modern self. In addition to the beautiful, Kant theorizes the sublime as an aesthetic experience where the imagination struggles to grasp something vast or formless. The sublime induces discomfort. Our senses fail, but reason asserts itself as superior to imagination, producing a mix of awe and humiliation. Where the beautiful harmonizes our faculties, the sublime confronts us with their discord. Yet it too points towards the moral power of the mind. Kant insists the sublime is not in nature itself, but within us, revealing the rational vocation of humanity. For Lyotard, the sublime becomes a central concern of postmodernism, which inherits Kant's legacy but turns its attention to historical trauma. The Holocaust becomes, in Lyotard's terms, the unpresentable, the failure of reason and art to encompass modern terror. Although Kant appeared detached from events like the French Revolution, his aesthetics offered a utopian vision of reconciliation amid chaos. His abstract categories, disinterested pleasure, sensus communis, and the sublime, carry historical weight, defining literature's role in both affirming and critiquing modernity. Coleridge blends Kantian philosophy with English Romanticism, prioritizing the imagination as the underlying force that heals fractured modern consciousness. Influenced by Kant, Descartes, and German idealists like Shelley, he develops a theory of criticism grounded in self-consciousness, freedom, and poetic creation. Coleridge valorizes disinterestedness, urging the critic to avoid personal bias and base judgments on enduring principles, not momentary taste or fashion. Like Kant, he believes great art transcends selfish subjectivity, but unlike Kant, he grants imagination the highest philosophical role. This asymplastic imagination synthesizes opposites, feeling and form, mind and nature, restoring harmony where reason alone cannot. Coleridge turns from political disappointment, especially after the French Revolution, towards a literature as a spiritual and civilizing mission. He seeks a secular priesthood of poets whose task is to unify society not through laws, but through imaginative insight. In Biographia Literaria, Coleridge outlines a program of practical criticism fusing Kantian formalism with poetic intuition to evaluate literature. He insists great poetry possesses unity of form, with all parts supporting one another to produce a singular emotional and aesthetic effect. He adopts and advances the notion of organic form, where a poem grows like a living organism rather than obeying mechanical rules. Coleridge's aesthetics also emphasize defamiliarization, where the poetic imagination revives tired perception and reveals the extraordinary in ordinary. The poem should not merely reflect reality, but transform it, making familiar objects appear new and strange through metaphor and vision. He also defends universality, arguing that great poetry speaks to all humans across rank and time, even if rooted in specific speech or form. Simultaneously, he defends originality, claiming that Wordsworth, Shakespeare, and Milton are great precisely because they broke from convention. These ideals, unity, defamiliarization, universality, originality, form the core of his literary philosophy and prefigure later formalist schools. Coleridge sees poetry as redemptive, but his vision excludes much of humanity, especially the uneducated, colonized, and poor. While his poetic ideals aspire to universality, his language often reveals classist and colonial biases, denying imagination and complexity to savages. He views imagination as a gift of spiritual refinement, unavailable to those outside Western intellectual traditions. This contradiction undermines his cosmopolitan claims, exposing the limits of romantic universalism when intertwined with imperial ideology. Despite these flaws, Coleridge significantly influenced later critics like Matthew Arnold and new critics, shaping the ethos of close reading and aesthetic autonomy. His ideas about poetic impersonality, moral elevation, and form persist in 20th century criticism, even as spiritual elitism draws increasing scrutiny. Coleridge embodies Romanticism's highest hopes and deepest contradictions, a belief in literature as salvation shadowed by exclusion. His legacy is thus both inspiring and problematic, a system striving for universal form while bound to particular historical limits. Percy Bysshe Shelley, shaped by Enlightenment radicalism and Romantic idealism, redefines poetry as a revolutionary force grounded in imagination and sympathy. In a defense of poetry, he critiques the failure of reason to deliver justice in post-revolutionary Europe, especially in England. He argues that science and politics, devoid of imagination, have worsened social inequality and reduced humans to mechanistic beings. Where Wollstonecraft emphasized rational cultivation, Shelley turns to poetic imagination as the agent of moral awakening and social empathy. He defines imagination as the ability to identify with others across boundaries, a creative expansion of the self toward fellow beings. Building on Hume's concept of sympathy, he positions poetry as the medium through which disparate individuals and classes might recognize shared humanity. The poet, for Shelley, becomes the unacknowledged legislator of the world, not by dictating law, but by renewing perception and resisting alienation. Shelley's politics are inseparable from his aesthetics, as both pursue solidarity not through systems, but through perception. Shelley fuses Enlightenment critique with Neoplatonic idealism, presenting poetry as the intuitive grasp of eternal truth beyond historical fragmentation. Drawing on Plotinus, he sees the poet as participating in the infinite generative unity out of multiplicity through contemplative vision. Yet this vision is tempered by humility. Poetry's truth is only ever a fleeting shadow of its original conception, lost in expression. Like Coleridge, Shelley valorizes defamiliarization, the poetic act that revives dull perception and shocks us into ethical awareness. Poetry creates anew the universe, freeing us from habitual thought and restoring our capacity to feel and to act. Language itself becomes metaphorical, not referential, revealing hidden relations and inviting transformation. Shelley's hope for poetry to heal social division was politically urgent, but remains vulnerable to charges of abstraction. Yet, unlike Coleridge, Shelley embraces social materiality, aligning poetic imagination with hunger, poverty, and injustice. He stands as Romanticism's most political voice, channeling Enlightenment values through visionary aesthetics. His synthesis of radical critique and metaphysical longing makes him both a voice of his age and a herald of future critical possibilities. Hegel's lecture on fine arts challenges romantic exaltations of imagination by declaring that art no longer meets modernity's highest needs. He historicizes aesthetics, arguing that art once embodied the spirit of entire civilizations, but now expresses only individual subjectivity. Ancient Greek art, which perfectly harmonized idea and form, marks the apex. Romantic art, inward and spiritualized, cannot achieve the same synthesis. Hegel views the imagination, unconstrained by reason or technique, as insufficient for truth. Only philosophy can now express the absolute. He criticizes both neoclassical rule-bound art and romantic genius worship, seeking instead a dialectical model of artistic development. The work of art is valuable insofar as it externalizes consciousness and reconciles spirit with the material world. Yet Hegel's Eurocentrism and elevation of philosophy over art led him to declare aesthetic decline in the very moment Romanticism was flourishing. While Hegel dismantles the romantic ideal, his theory deeply influenced Marx and modern aesthetics. He closes the romantic circle not with imagination, but with self-conscious history, redefining art as a past expression of communal spirit. The rise of print culture in the 18th and 19th century Britain profoundly transformed the condition of literary production, dissemination, and reception. High circulation periodicals became influential arbiters of taste, subjecting writers such as Coleridge, Keats, Shelley to both popular acclaim and scathing reviews. These publications helped create a mass literary audience, but also imposed new pressures, including commercial expectations and ideological scrutiny. Romantic writers, while often hostile to the periodical press, were nonetheless compelled to engage with it, sometimes strategically, sometimes defensively. Shelley, for instance, was acutely aware that the press could reshape authorial meaning and weaponize reception against radical politics. In this volatile context, reader response dynamics emerged. The author's intent became secondary to the varied interpretations and reactions of diverse audiences. Romantic texts, despite their lofty ideals, were enmeshed in the very market mechanism they critiqued, caught between idealism and material constraint. Political censorship, shifting readership, and the economics of publishing all influenced what was written, printed, and remembered. These tensions gave rise to the cultural battles over authorship, authority, and interpretation that characterized the birth of modern literary criticism, shaped as much by media environments as by philosophical ideas. This chapter presents Enlightenment and Romantic thinkers as deeply engaged in defining literature's purpose between reason and imagination. From Hume's sceptical empiricism to Shelley's visionary poetry, these figures wrestle with canon, beauty, freedom, and social justice. While many sought universality, their ideals were often marked by exclusions of class, gender, race, and empire. Literature emerges in this chapter as both aesthetic form and ethical practice, bound to its historical conditions yet reaching beyond them. Rather than resolve the tensions between Enlightenment and Romanticism, the chapter invites us to inhabit it critically through reading. Thank you for your attention.